Welcome to today's webinar, Affordable Housing and Recovery, Cross-Sector Collaborative Conversation, with professionals from criminal justice, behavioral and mental health, and housing discussing ways to support recovery in rural communities. Thank you to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Rural Capacity Building Program for sponsoring today's event. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Up first is Natasha Moody. Natasha is a research associate at the Housing Assistance Council. Her research primarily focuses on equity in rural housing and community development. Before HAC, Natasha received her undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and recently completed the Stevenson Center Applied Community Economic Development Graduate Fellowship at Illinois State University. She also served as an AmeriCorps member in Tampa, Florida, and a Teach for America Corps member in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. It's also my pleasure to introduce Michelle White. She serves in dual roles as both a Senior Policy Advisor for the Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA, as well as Senior Program Advisor for the State Justice Institute, SGI. At BJA, she supports statewide grantees of comprehensive opioid, stimulant, and substance use programs, along with work in areas of prosecutor and court diversion programs, child welfare activities, harm reduction strategies, and support for rural communities across the portfolio. At SJI, she strengthens, supports, and guides the work of local state court grantees across numerous program areas and monitors national trends in justice and their potential impact on state courts and their justice system partners. Ms. White has over 20 years of experience working in the intersection of justice and health systems, which includes providing training and technical assistance, program evaluation, and practical experience as a drug court coordinator, criminal justice planner, probation officer, and police officer. She graduated from George Mason University with a master's in public administration and a bachelor's in administration of justice. And our final speaker today, Donald McDonald. Donald is a person thriving in recovery from severe mental and substance use disorders. Previously, Donald served as the National Field Director of Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Executive Director of Addiction Professionals of North Carolina, and the Director of Advocacy and Education at Recovery Communities of North Carolina. He spent most of his early behavioral health career providing peer-based services and case management at long-term residential recovery programs serving men and women experiencing homelessness. His current role is Technical Expert Lead at JBS International, where he provides training and technical assistance to HRSA-funded rural consortia across the country as they build capacity in response to the overdose and addiction crisis. Donald is a veteran, husband, father, grandfather, social worker, licensed clinical addiction specialist, and a recovery coach professional. He holds a Bachelor's of Education from North Carolina State University and a Master's of Social Work from UNC Chapel Hill. Donald is a proud recipient of the NCADD Bronze Key Award and the North Carolina Attorney General's Dogwood Award. Donald is the producer and host of a Freedom from Addiction podcast, No Thanks But Yes, which features chill conversations with splendid people who have overcome chaotic substance relationships via many, many pathways. Now I'd like to pass the microphone over to our first speaker, Natasha Moody.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natasha Moody. I'm a research associate at the Housing Assistance Council. And first and foremost, I would like to thank Don and Michelle for being willing to speak with us today and share their expertise. I really look forward to their comments, and thank you all for attending. We really want to bring Michelle and Donald together for this cross-sector conversation because they not only have expertise in their respective fields, criminal justice, mental and behavioral health, but they also have expertise in leading communities through the cross-sector approaches to supporting recovery in rural communities. Some of the most recent data around this issue from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health reports that 46.3 million people were diagnosed with substance use disorders, and 6.7 million of those diagnosed living in rural areas. And the most recent CDC provisional drug overdose death data reported over 101,000 overdose deaths in a one-year period. And in rural communities, we see statistics around 2 in 5 rural adults say they know someone who's struggling currently or has struggled with addiction. And so the statistics around how substance use disorders can affect an individual, a household, or community can also include incarceration rates for drug-related arrests and convictions, hospital admissions, recidivism, even intersects with the rates of chronic homelessness in an area and more. And this data may demonstrate the numbers and magnitude of this problem on a larger scale, but can't encapsulate the lived experiences of rural households or communities. And so addressing this overdose crisis and supporting recovery really involves a lot of collaboration across many sectors. That may include housing, mental and behavioral health, public health, policy, criminal justice, and other fields, and their practitioners and experts who have and will continue to advocate and provide much needed services and support for residents in recovery. There was a recently released Recovery Ecosystem Index and Mapping Tool, which is created by the Fletcher Group, University of Chicago, and East Tennessee State University that represented the strength of a county's recovery ecosystem. And that recovery ecosystem, they used an index that included substance use disorder treatment options, the continuum of substance use disorder support, and then needed infrastructure and social elements. And that included access to substance use treatment facilities, recovery residencies, the magnitude of severe housing cost burden in the area, and medical factors, the intersection with the criminal justice system, and mental and behavioral health factors and accessibility. And so we see through that tool and many other research that there's ecosystems within communities that can provide support for recovery that involves that cross-sector collaboration. Housing is an essential part of this holistic and collaborative approach to recovery. Residents need affordable, safe, and healthy housing options. The housing approaches include things from or initiatives including recovery housing, supportive housing, emergency shelters, and other approaches to federally subsidized housing options for residents who may have completed rehabilitation. We know that rural communities across the country overall have a need for affordable housing. And there are rural residents who are in recovery or who have previously been justice involved or disabled or unhoused who also need access to affordable housing. There have been a range of innovations that we've been privy to learning as HAC has continued to learn more in this space and be involved in this space. Some of these approaches involve this cross-sector housing solution in rural communities. Some of those examples we've seen include mental health organizations partnering with landlords to ensure acceptance of housing choice vouchers for residents in recovery, or creating partnerships with hotels to provide emergency shelter for unhoused residents. We've seen that there are emergency shelters partnering with public housing agencies to create a pathway towards permanent and consistent housing. We've also seen housing organizations partner with the courts and the criminal justice system to offer supportive housing and rehabilitation as an alternative to potentially a drug-related conviction. We've also seen housing organizations partner with the medical system to provide supportive services to residents who may need services while in affordable housing complexes. And recently, we've also come across universities offering on-campus recovery housing for students. And so we've been learning about these different innovations and look forward to learning more from Michelle and Donald today. And last week, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD announced grant awards to 46 communities for this coordinated and collaborative options for housing and supportive services for people experiencing homelessness in rural communities, specifically who need supportive services. And so we continue to see examples of and funding for these cross-sector approaches, but also are receiving questions from the communities that we work with about learning more about this. So we were thrilled that Donald and Michelle were willing to join us today and to share their knowledge. So addressing this overdose epidemic and providing support for residents in recovery really is best achieved through this collaborative approach. And the magnitude of these issues in rural communities is a focus of the Housing Assistance Council, and we look forward to learning more today and throughout our time, or throughout as we engage in how is the intersection of housing and recovery. And so as we hear from our speakers today, from our audience, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We will have some time for a question and answer at the end of the session. And I really look forward to the comments from our speakers. And so now I will turn it over to Donald. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? That's awesome. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Donald McDonald, and I work with JBS International. For decades, this organization, woman-founded, woman-run, woman-led organization, has been working in vulnerable communities since the mid 80s to help support community-centered and organization-centered solutions, strength-based solutions to wicked problems, unsolvable problems. And currently, we're in a partnership with Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, in their Rural Community Opioid Response Program grant. And we have over 500 rural cross-sector consortia that have received funding and training and technical assistance to solve um, issues around overdose. So the mortality and morbidity associated with substance use through enhancing primary prevention, harm reduction, access to treatment, opioid treatment, and recovery support services, including recovery supportive housing, including enhancing access to social determinants of health, social factors of wellness. That's what I get to do. And the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy at HRSA are a splendid group of public health analysts and passionate advocates for setting up rural communities for success. That particular grant is it is community centered and it is consortia driven. I don't go into communities and tell folks what to do, and neither do the feds. However, very thoughtfully and mindfully have designed this funding opportunity to promote a collaborative and cross-sector approach. And it's super exciting to watch. We encourage communities to get everyone at the table. I mean, everyone, and to continue to enhance and expand their consortia, um, to conduct an assessment of the strengths that they possess and the needs that are in their community, and then to strategically plan how they, with their resources and the people at the table and the funding that the government has provided and the training and technical assistance that I get to offer, how they can, through some SMART goals, make appreciable progress through the course of 3 years. Because the thing with cross-sector work that's critical is one has to sense forward motion. And the only way we're going to experience forward motion is if we strategically plan through some SMART goals and objectives, that we have a shared vision within our consortium for what we want our community to look like, and that all of these be living documents, and that it is entered into with the spirit of sustainability from the get-go. We have a splendid opportunity to infuse a community with these resources for a period of time, but folks are finding ways to sustain the impactful work that they've been doing. It's a very data-driven process as well, performance indication measures that helps with sustainability as well. So I'm bragging on the work that we do, and that I'm seeing success in profoundly um, gifted communities in the inherent strengths that they possess as rural communities, as tight consortia already. However, some amazing challenges that they face as well, and absolute resource deserts at times. And I'm seeing progress, and I owe it to them, but I also owe it to the process and the framework that has been presented to them, this cross-sector business. So now I want to get into myself. I want to talk about me. I live as a case study of a person who had high problem severity, high problem complexity as it relates to mental and substance use disorders, yet is sitting in front of you now thriving in 18 years of sustained recovery, with advanced degrees, working from home, family and friends. So I am a person thriving in sustained recovery from severe mental and substance use disorders for 18 years. husband, father, grandfather. I throw all that in my intro because I'm just a person. I've rejoined the human experience, and I'm playing all the lovely roles that I get to play, and grandpa is one of them, which is kind of mind blowing. Um, but there came a point in time when I entered into the helping profession and then entered into macro social work and advocacy and education and policy stuff, where I realized that I am thriving in recovery through a process of dumb luck and privilege. Yet I was educated within a system that had me saying to people, uh, if you want it bad enough, you come get you some. If I can do it, you can do it. And that failed to recognize the complexity of people's needs and experiences and the profound barriers that many people face that I just didn't. And my life has not been charmed. I was born into a home with a family history of mental and substance use disorders. That is not a forecast. That is not fate. However, it does create a bit of vulnerability. Some estimate up to a 50% estimated familial influence in this vulnerability. I had other things going on. I was unfortunately experiencing a good deal of trauma early in my life. I had a very high adverse childhood experiences score. I live with co-occurring mental disorders and learning disabilities. I'm a little weird, and that's all right. It's worked out well for me, but however, the confluence of these risk factors set me up for experiencing severe mental and substance use disorders and putting me into conflict with systems of care, systems of justice, systems of law enforcement, and that's quite unfortunate. Also, the biggest risk factor, as you all know, is also access. So as I'm experiencing these traumas internally alone and they're wiring me towards vulnerability, I found something that almost worked. And that's substances. And it's a splendid thing that we unfortunately discover that almost works. Brought me relief, brought me um, some balming of physical and emotional pain, not a sustainable experience. So I had early childhood initiation of use, and that too increases problem severity and problem complexity. So that is why. And a lot of people use substances, but not everybody experiences problematic use, and even fewer of us experience pathological use on to severity on on the spectrum. And those are the reasons why. Those are the reasons why. So what's exciting about this is we know why people sometimes have a problematic relationship with substances, why some people experience addiction. We know it's not a mystery, and let's not let it be a mystery. We know too much now to be offering solutions that don't address the reasons that we know why. So that is why I experienced severe substance use disorder. How did I get well? How did I end up here today? And um, this is that dumb luck and privilege pathway that I joyously experienced. I'm also a family member of loss in this experience. I've had two sisters that I have lost that did not have the same charmed pathway, and I did what I was taught to do as a family member and as a provider, a clinical provider, which was tough love. And that was just a big mistake. But anyway, how did I get well? How did I get well? So, first of all, for some reason, people respected me and my inherent dignity and worth, and I picked up on that. And I have come to learn that not all people experience that in their interactions with different sectors. Um, Folks showed me compassion. Um, And as I list these things, these these the ingredients that went into this thriving recovery, I'm going to tell you which sectors you can bring to the table that will help make this a deliberate pathway, that will help make this policy, that will help make this not luck, because luck's not scalable public health policy. Respecting my inherent dignity and worth and showing me compassion, y'all need to partner with harm reduction coalitions and drug user unions, survivor unions. The core of this house within prevention, the core of harm reduction services, its core uh, principle is respecting the inherent dignity and worth of all people, no matter what. And that's how we begin. Bring them to the table. They'll be a positive influence on your coalitions and in your community work. I had immediate access. I had immediate access. I had multiple subpar treatment events throughout my life. But when this time came 18 years ago, when I was facing a period of hopelessness and despair and likely going to quit, I had sufficient motivation with my beloved wife and my 4 young children to give it one more go toward wellness. And what did I have? I had immediate access to evidence based co occurring disorders, trauma informed inpatient hospitalization treatment. I had insurance that paid for it. I had extended family that were able to come in and help out my partner to deal with my absence for a month. So I had that. Where do we part? We need to partner with psychiatrists. We need to partner with social workers, hospitals, treatment centers. We need to partner with payers. We need to partner with payers. Um, I had access to treatment immediately with my insurance, but about 3 weeks in, they said that this fellow with high problem severity, high problem complexity, and 20 years of substance use was all better after 3 weeks. My doc at this treatment facility said I wasn't better. And I said, I can't afford you. And he says, don't worry about it, man. We got you. Just pay what you can. And this wasn't some shady place. This was legit, CARF accredited treatment center that respected my inherent dignity and worth and gave me the time and space to try and stabilize and set forward a process of wellness that worked. Need to partner with payers. Then they connect me with Step Down. They returned me to my community. They recognized that substance use disorder is not an acute moral failing, and they recognize that this is going to be a lifelong process. So I got stepped down into a lower level of care, some outpatient connected with psychiatrists to continue the pharmacotherapeutic treatment of my co-occurring mental disorders. I got connected with a robust community of recovery because one of the other evidence supported pathways to sustained wellness is one of the evidence supported pathways to sustain wellness is this business of connection with a community of one's peers, pro-social activities with a healthy peer group with some common goals. And but what I had was not just one in one church basement, a couple knuckleheads that this fellow with all this trauma was forced to partner with and say, these are my new family. I had 500 because I lived in an urban area. So I got to find my people. So we need to partner with once again psychiatry. We need to partner with primary care. We need to partner with communities of recovery. And how do we create diverse mutual support experiences? We need to partner well with Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, obviously, for nearly 9 decades, the mainstay of this space, but there's more, and people deserve more choices. And champions within these communities are the ones who are going to help expand and to seed alternative mutual support programs that support moderation, that support medications for opioid use disorder, that support harm reduction pathways, that support secular pathways of recovery that people deserve as well. So bring AANA and New Kids on the Block, bring recovery community organizations to the table. Check out Association of Recovery Community Organizations, ARCO. Folks who have had the wherewithal to join that association are all mapped in the United States. Or you can Google RCO, Recovery Community Organization, or Recovery Community Center in your neck of the woods. Get those folks to the table. Trust me, you need recovery, organized recovery, professionalized recovery sector at the table. I returned home to a recovery supportive employer before that was even a thing. Before that was a thing, I was experiencing some major problems with my employer, and I went to him one day and I said, "Man, I need to go to treatment." And he said, "Okay, cool, we got you. We'll save your chair for you." Mm. They checked on me. They offered me FMLA, all these things, and I mean, that's they ought to, they have to, but they don't always. And in this instance, over 18 years ago, this fellow was an interesting fellow in that he was very supportive. I wonder how he was impacted by it. But once again, this was luck because I've had many mates who did not receive that. They simply got fired. And I'm sure Michelle can talk to you about, the ADA on that one. But who can we partner with to not leave this to luck, to keep this a deliberate thing? We've got a great initiative in the country now called Recovery Friendly Workplace, and that is an organized. So Google that, and great recommendations for employers. Right on. Thanks, Amy. Recommendations for employers, but also bring employers to your table, bring business owners to your table, bring business owner associations to your table, bring chambers of commerce to your table. Because if we're trying to promote sustained recovery from mental and substance use disorders, and not just the cessation of clinical measured chaos, but actually coming and rejoining the citizenry, we have to be mindful about reducing the barriers and promoting the success of folks. So bring them to the table. I had a very much a recovery supportive home to return to as well. I'm timing myself too. I had a recovery supportive home to return to as well through dumb luck. I had a lovely home, a lovely wife who was a medical professional herself, is a medical professional. And it was not all roses and lovely Valentine's Day. It's tough when people get into recovery. Just quitting drugs and alcohol does not transform a human overnight. There is much growing up in public and much emotional dysregulation and often returns to use, recurrence, relapse. But I had that, I did not have to worry about where I laid my head, and I had reliable transportation. I had couple cars, that's just the way it was. And how do we bring that into happening? Well, we've got the Housing Assistance Council here, and the resource that they've just created, and I watched the webinar on it, is absolutely splendid. One of the problems that we face is misinformation too. We assume that we're not eligible for certain protections under law or certain opportunities for funding or programming because we've had criminal justice system entanglements or a history of alcohol and drug use. But they've done a splendid job of letting folks know, nope, you're eligible too. So come get you some. And I shared that with my 500 rural consortia as a tool. So yeah, I shared that with folks. Diverse communities of recovery. Recovery visibility is a big role. Uh, Outside of even your little mutual aid meetings or whatever, but when I went to places to work, I had leaders, inspirational leaders that let me know they were in recovery. And this inspired me to come get me some more. And that's a big deal. And that's really just getting people in recovery, diverse pathways of recovery to come to the table and creating safe space bringing people who use substances to the table as well. And I can offer guidance on that as well. But recovery visibility was a big deal. So one of the final things I'll talk to you about right now is when I got that uh, notion to come get me some more to grab another ring, I had no arbitrary obstacles standing in my way because my experience as a drug using person was a clean cut white dude in a minivan. And so I did not, I was less likely to intersect with the criminal justice system. And when I did intersect with some enforcers of that system, I did not get entangled, and that happens. Unfortunately, we have a very inequitable system out there, and we come about it honestly. We come about it honestly, but if we allow it to continue, and I'm talking about the racist drug war. If we allow it to continue, and I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings on that one, but the fact is the ghost is still haunting us. It's still alive and well. Systems are inequitable, and unless we right them, it's not going to happen. So what can we do? So when Donald McDonald decided he wanted to go to grad school and get way too many student loans, when he decided he wanted to interview with these organizations that did background checks, when he decided he wanted to lead these organizations, and I didn't have those, how can we create that for many of the men and women I served who couldn't do that? And that is first, non-arrest diversion programs are splendid. Law enforcement assisted diversion. If we're still going to have a criminalized drug supply, let's lean into non-arrest, diversion programs. Let's partner with universities and colleges to create opportunities for people who have had criminal justice system entanglements and experiences with alcohol and substance use disorder have more opportunity. Advocacy organizations that are leading the way and doing some of the policy and legislative advocacy that maybe we can't because of our funding constraints, bring them to the table. Money people, foundations, uh, broadband providers, um, and all that business. And what I'm going to ask you is what did I miss? What I tried to do was tell you the story of how I experienced addiction, how I recovered from addiction, how we need to make that a policy for folks to provide these opportunities. I got through dumb luck, and we do that through cross-sector collaboration and with a will to do it. And I know I missed things and stuff because I'm not every man, and so I'm looking forward to some questions around that. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donald. Really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing with your story with us, and also making those connections for those in the call who are hoping to, as you mentioned, to create a pathway to recovery for folks in their community. So thank you so much for your insights and thoughts today, and for sharing with us. I will hand it over. Sorry.
I forgot to mention
Sorry.
in the housing one. I only mentioned y'all because I was so taken with y'all, but y'all are a convener and a connector. And I was going to mention National Association of Recovery Residences, which y'all already work with, the Fletcher Center of Excellence on Recovery Housing, HRSA funded, transit providers, and churches for the transportation issues. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. We'll take all the insights. So thank you so much. Thank you again for your vulnerability and sharing your story. And we celebrate your recovery and all of the communities that you're now sharing your insights with to support recovery in their communities. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Michelle now. And so Michelle, thanks again for joining us. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Natasha, for providing the framework at the outset of the conversation, and sincerely, Donald, for you sharing your expertise, your work, and most importantly, your story. As previously mentioned, my name is Michelle White, a Senior Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We all refer to it as BJA because it gets really long if we do not, which is located in the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. At BJA, our primary functions are to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy development to support state, local, and tribal justice strategies to achieve safer communities. We do this primarily providing grants and training and technical assistance for projects that span the entire justice system. Within BJA, I work primarily on the Comprehensive Opioid Stimulant and Substance Use Program, or COSUP, which I tend to describe as nearly all things at the intersection of justice that address substance misuse. We'll talk more about COSUP shortly. I want to start actually with a bit of history about the substance use crisis in our country, or at least about the past 20 years. We know there have been 3 waves of opioid-related deaths in our country in that time, and we know that fentanyl is the most recent driver of those deaths. This is particularly important to understand because in some areas of the country, opioids were not really an issue until the introduction of fentanyl. Stimulants such as cocaine and methamphetamine have historically been drugs of choice in many areas where they did not see opioids. But now that fentanyl can be found in nearly every type of drug, from marijuana to cocaine to meth, and even in pressed pills, causing even more overdoses, both fatal and non-fatal, than we have ever experienced across the entire country. Additionally, there are some places where fentanyl has moved from an adulterant, meaning an accident, to an actual drug of choice. And still others where drugs like xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer, are both an adulterant in drugs and also being sought by people who use drugs. And for that, there is no reversal drug, such as naloxone, or as you all might be familiar, Narcan, for this powerful narcotic. The impacts of substance misuse extend beyond overdose and death. These impacts extend beyond the personal impacts of those with substance use disorders to family, friends, businesses, and communities. I would ask you to take a moment and picture in your mind someone that has a substance use disorder and that is also justice involved. So who do you see? The person you see is shaped by our own individual and unique experiences, whether they be positive or negative, and whether or not we have received any education about SUD or not. The gender, race, age, and circumstances of that person you envisioned are shaped by our own personal experiences and are likely impacted by some level of stigma or bias. Did you picture a person that is young, a male, a homeless person, a person that's incarcerated? As a person myself who has worked in the criminal justice field for over 20 years, as mentioned, as a police officer, a probation and parole officer, a drug court coordinator, and many other things along the way, some I asked for and some I did not, I can tell you that I have a lot of experiences that shape who I see. I have seen young males that are homeless, for sure, but I've also seen pregnant mothers. I have seen both very young and much older people, affluent and impoverished, men and women and their children, varying race and ethnicity, some who utilize medication-assisted treatment and some who do not, those with mental health and other co-occurring disorders, and that's just to mention a few. All of them were also involved in the justice system, and they all had to deal with the stigma related to not only their diagnosis, but also the stigma of justice involvement and the lack of access to services of one kind or another, all while on their road to recovery. Since Donald did such a great job of covering all the SUD pieces of this conversation, I want to talk about the justice piece, because when I say someone is justice involved, that can mean more than just they are or have been incarcerated. So bear with me while I attempt to do a very quick little Justice System 101. Broadly, the justice system includes civil, criminal, juvenile, and family justice systems. There are a lot of professionals, and I mean a lot, that work within these systems, making the entire justice system extremely complex for those operating within and outside of the system. I'm going to take just a minute to list some of those practitioners. I want you to imagine being justice involved and having one, some, or all of those persons involved in your life. So let's start with the criminal justice system. This can include law enforcement, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, clerks and court administrators, pretrial service agencies, jails, prisons, and probation and parole officers. If that's not overwhelming enough, if your juvenile justice system involved, you have another set of people who closely mirror the criminal justice system. And additionally, in the family justice system, we would add child welfare, attorneys for parents and children, among many others. And then other civil issues that can include other topics like housing, which is one you all are probably particularly aware of. So for example, someone could be on court-ordered probation for a criminal offense and also have a child welfare court case. They could be in a drug court program and also have an eviction case in civil court. They could be the parent of a teenager with truancy issues that also has a mental health disorder. Imagine navigating all of those systems at the same time, also knowing that each of these situations means that other systems are involved as well, including substance use treatment providers, mental health treatment agencies, and schools, just to name a very few. And then in addition to barriers that likely exist around employment, childcare, transportation, food insecurity, and housing. And then layer on top of this the challenges of being in rural communities where availability and access to services is extremely limited. So after all of this not very upbeat discussion, where do you all fit in? In the past 20 plus years of my work in the justice system, I can tell you that time and time again, one of the greatest barriers for justice-involved people and justice-involved people with substance use disorders is housing. I can also tell you from personal experience that for justice practitioners, housing is one of the single most daunting services to tackle, particularly in rural communities. As these practitioners, we know the justice system. We do not know, understand, and are quite overwhelmed by the housing system. We don't know the rules and regulations around housing, or in many instances, who to even ask. So how do we close this gap? Some of what I'm about to say will definitely mirror some of the things that Donald has discussed, but these are from my perspective. First, by joining conversations like this one, acknowledging gaps in knowledge are an extremely important first step. Second, by educating yourself about substance use disorder broadly and more narrowly within the communities that you serve. Ensure this education includes treatment for substance use disorder, as well as particularly to develop an understanding of what medication-assisted treatment is to overcome any misgivings about allowing people who utilize this treatment in support of their recovery. Third, seek out people that have lived experience, as Donald said, both with SUD and justice involvement, to participate in advisory bodies to understand their experiences and perspectives, and then actually use that information in your planning around housing. Fourth, connect with justice professionals and their advisory bodies, such as criminal justice coordinating councils. Do not be afraid to contact the decision makers in the justice system. And when I say this, I mean people like sheriffs and judges. They are community leaders and they recognize the challenges of housing for justice-involved people. Trust me when I say they will be happy to hear from you. They will make time in their schedules to talk with you because you are bringing them something that they cannot do on their own. Fifth, educate justice and treatment practitioners about what you have to offer. Again, housing is what they need, not what they do. Sixth, be candid with those folks, and I mean candid, about any questions or concerns you have about supporting justice-involved people and their families. Tell them what you need in order to partner. Partnership is not a one-way street, so make sure those practitioners know the limitations of what you can do and where resources and funding are lacking. And finally, pursue ways to partner to obtain those resources and funding for housing. There are many opportunities for funding for recovery and other housing that are outside of where you normally look for funding. For example, BJA's annual solicitation for COSUP, the project that I work within, is currently open. It allows for funding for recovery housing for up to 30% of the funded project. So when I say COSUP is all things at the intersection of safety and justice, the fact that we are saying up to 30% of that funding that you might apply for is eligible for housing demonstrates exactly how important we know housing is for the success of people who are working on their recovery. I'm going to drop the solicitation in the chat when I'm done talking so that you all can share that with your partners. And please, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you or they may have about that. Again, it's only one example, but one that is close to what I know, so that is the one I'm sharing. In conclusion, I want to attempt to sum up why this collaboration with justice is so important. Earlier, I asked you to envision the person for who you represents a justice-involved person with a substance use disorder. Now remove the justice piece and picture someone just with a substance use disorder. And I don't say just like only like it's not a big deal. For many of us, the picture changes because this now becomes an actual person in our family, a friend, or someone you know through some other very personal connection. In many ways, they have some of the same needs as those with justice involvement. And housing is likely to be one of the barriers that, if addressed, are life-changing for that person, their family, and ultimately for their communities. You all play a vital role in the ability to support that change. So I challenge you to consider the points I outlined previously and take action to support justice-involved people and their families impacted by the substance use crisis. So I will drop this in the chat. And I think now we're going to transition to Donald and I just chatting a little bit or entertaining some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle, for your insights and for the very clear outlines of how housers can take steps towards, all this that we're discussing. And the history around how this epidemic has evolved was really great to understand. And the challenging of potentially our archetypes around who's affected by this and how that may influence how we approach it. Really appreciate your insights and comments today. And so, yes, as you mentioned, I would like to offer some time to you and Donald to offer any other comments you may have, whether it's to each other or, after hearing each other's comments, it may have sparked something. So I'll leave that time to you, but also to our audience, please feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat and we'll address those in a moment as well. So I'll turn it over to you both if you have any additional comments.
For Michelle. Hello, Michelle. So I've been engaged in multiple sectored solution-oriented work for a while now, and we're all from very different areas and sometimes varying degrees of stigma surrounding, and we got different goals as well too. And many of my consortia are asking for, tips on how to bring law enforcement or criminal justice jurists to the table, meeting them where they are, with an enforcement orientation or, with the drugs or bad orientation. And so yeah, how to bring local law enforcement and justice type folks to the table, and kind of come together, meet them where they are, but don't leave them there. And we've got stuff to learn from law enforcement as well. I'm not sitting in a high chair on this, but there's added layers of stigma.
Sure. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to share my experience and what I believe works and what other folks have said work. It's more than one thing because, to your point, and I think the most important point is to meet people where they are. So, as human beings, when we are told you're doing it wrong, that didn't go so well, regardless of who you are. And so when you approach law enforcement in particular, or really, frankly, other justice professionals, starting with you're doing it wrong is difficult to undo, to say the least, because from their perspective, if you're meeting them really at the enforcement conversation, they're not doing it wrong. They're enforcing, which is what they signed up to do. So in order to move the conversation, there's a number of sort of different, I would say, tactics that I have heard people employ. And it kind of depends on the person and the circumstance. But there's a number of different things. So first is the approach. And sometimes it's who you approach. Sometimes it's leadership. And sometimes it is finding that one officer that you can start the conversation with. And that one officer has additional conversations and you start moving from there. One sort of more specific example of that I have heard a number of folks say, and I would think this is quite true, is the stigma around mental health is slightly different than the stigma around substance use. And folks are much more likely to be amenable more quickly to a conversation around mental health. And so, for example, the officers that are trained in CIT, which is how to respond to folks in crisis, often become the people who are more amenable to go from mental health to substance use.
Mm.
So sometimes starting with those officers. The other thing goes to, what I said, some of my comments, which were, you never know what people are personally struggling with, whether themselves, and that could be something that is helpful or really not helpful to you having a conversation, or they have an understanding and it's personal for them because someone in their lives has been impacted. And so sometimes that is the person that you're going to get. Understanding that if you go, to example, to do a presentation to a room full of law enforcement, it's very unlikely someone's just going to stand up and say, pick me, I want to work on this. But they might meet you in the hallway after.
Yeah, that
Um,
happens a
yeah,
lot.
and
Yeah.
they might become your most valuable asset. Some of it is never, and this is true for people across the entire justice continuum, having never received any training about the science, the neuroscience of addiction. And that can be quite powerful. And through some work I'm currently doing around the topic of harm reduction, what we've heard people say quite frequently is the messenger, the deliverer of that is very important. And that, for example, addiction psychiatrists are very, very well respected. And that is who people want to listen to.
Mm.
And then I've talked a lot yet again. I warned y'all I do this. So
Yeah.
the other thing I would say is peer-to-peer connections, super important. So one
Facts.
place that has really progressed in their thinking, making the connections. Now, I have been warned that can backfire if you turn it into sort of a competition, because people don't always say, everybody has if they're doing it, I'm going to not do it. So you really need to know the people in the community and the folks that you're talking to. So I'm sure I could go on, but those are some of the things that I have. Oh, and not exposing to information or a conversation one time, but it being an ongoing conversation. So like one roll call training or one video, one and done is not going to do it. You're talking about changing people's hearts and minds.
Those are solid strategies for sure. And there's a listing of evidence-based tactics.
Mhm.
I can share those documents with folks on changing hearts and minds, and one of them is education, obviously displacing misinformation or absence of information with the science, and some data showing the deliverer of that as well. If you have a person who has experienced substance use disorder, but also carries some gravitas to deliver the science, that it can have double the impact
Mhm.
on changing stigmatizing attitudes and intended behaviors as well. So education is a big deal, and contact is one. Exposing folks who normally interact with us in our most unlovely phase to a more diverse face experience of people impacted by this and family members, and that lodges loose the biases we've come about honestly through our personal experience through dealing with crisis and unloveliness.
Right.
Yeah, right on. Solid strategies.
Great. Well, thank you both for that conversation. Of course, if at any point you would like to add any more commentary that's not specific to questions you're receiving, please feel free, because every nugget you've given us today has been really insightful, and really appreciate your knowledge today. I will, if that's okay, transition to maybe looking at some of the audience questions. And I will read some of the questions we've received, but if there are folks in the audience who would like to ask their questions verbally, you can feel free to use the raise hand function, which will be on the top of your screen, normally the third, or the top of your window, the third icon with the raise hand. You can raise your hand and we can invite you to unmute if you would prefer to ask your question verbally. Donald, this first question is for you. You mentioned the name of an organization that you transitioned to after your 3 weeks of rehabilitation. I'm not sure if that specifically is
Right.
coming to mind, but someone asked if you could restate the name of that organization, please.
Sure, you betcha. Well, not so much an organization, but my problem severity and problem complexity and my capacity to pay made me eligible for inpatient hospitalization event. And fortunately, unfortunately, we've been leaning into criminalizing chaotic relationships with substances. And if we do medicalize it, we lean into acute care models. Like, let's get you in, let's get you bandaged up, detoxed, and fixed. Now go keep your nose clean now that you know better. No, it is strikingly similar to asthma, hypertension, and diabetes in its appearance and in its treatment. So I got stepped down to outpatient services, to optional outpatient services to stay connected with people, and a couple hours a week to come together for some group and some education and stuff like that. And I could have sustained even after that kind of some one-on-one. So maintaining some kind of provider relationship that's low barrier with folks, paired up with connecting them with communities of recovery. And I emphasize the diversity of the communities of recovery to be important, because with the nearly 9 decades old institutions that we have, their norms and beliefs and stuff often can be hostile towards people taking medications for opioid use disorder, opioid agonist medications, and that is the one medicine that's reducing mortality by 50%. So you want the pharmacotherapy to address this chronic illness, but you also want to come get your people. So how do you make that happen? Well, you got to create new convenings of people. Harm Reduction Works, Medication Assisted Recovery Anonymous. There's others, and often these are only available digitally right now. But I'm a digital citizen, and I connect with people digitally, but they're available in person. And when I talked about bringing your local recovery community to the table, is they can become champions to seed these alternative meetings. And I did that. I was working at a opioid treatment program when I first started in my career, and people taking methadone for their severe opioid use disorder couldn't find their people because there was a massive stigma against methadone. And so I did some research and discovered this meeting called Methadone Anonymous. I mean, it's this 12-step program, but it recognizes the benefit of methadone and buprenorphine. And I seeded it with, because it didn't exist. So we seeded it with more open-minded members of traditional communities of recovery to create this opportunity. And eventually, if you're patient, people will come, people will take stewardship over it. It will develop its own norms and traditions and language and everything. And then you step away. And it's a beautiful thing to see happen. And honestly, that's how Narcotics Anonymous started. Is there was an AA champion named Houston that went to the Lexington narcotics farm where we were imprisoning people addicted to drugs. And he said, I want them to come get some of this goodie. And he started something there, and it became Addicts Anonymous, which no longer exists. But that was when 12 Step left AA and went into another community seeded by AA. And then they took stewardship, and it became its own thing. And it's a beautiful thing. But we need to think outside the box and create more opportunities for folks. We have a tradition in this country of thinking not only who is a drug addict, and I'm using quotes around that word, but also what is treatment, what is recovery, et cetera. And it's very much rooted in a 9 decades old 12-step model, which is, while it claims to be a medical model, it is still pretty rooted in moral, theoretical elements as well. So we need to just shake all that loose and meet people where they are, like Michelle said. Yep.
Thank you. Michelle, I believe this question is directed to you. One of our participants shared that they've reached out to their local sheriff's office and that they were not very receptive. One of the questions they had for this webinar today is, if the police are not willing to help, then outside of that, where can we start to let people know we exist and are willing to help them? You shared some wonderful advice earlier, but want to know if there's anything else you'd like to share on that topic.
Sure. And I can focus again, like on the justice part of the conversation. So first, I would say don't give up on the sheriff or the sheriff's office. that's a hard thing to do, right? When they say we're not interested, and I won't pretend to know what your approach was. It could have been perfect, and they're just not going to make it happen. But sometimes it is starting with, and this I guess is a helpful hint I didn't share, starting with what's in it for them. Regardless of, you might get to what's in it for the people that they interact with, but what's in it for them, and how you can be helpful to them, alleviate some of their problems, whether it's jail overcrowding or, you talk to most sheriffs, and most sheriffs are in charge of their local jail, not everywhere, but in most places. The thing that they keeps them up at night is worrying about people who might die in their custody, or be suffering in their custody. And so if people are incarcerated for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is they don't have anywhere else to be, and housing is that barrier, that's an important discussion to continue to have. So the other piece is, law enforcement is often the most visual part of the justice system, but they are by far not the only piece. I can tell you that the people who are supervising folks on community supervision, whether it's pre-trial or post-trial, so post-trial probation and parole officers struggle every day to help support the folks under their supervision to find housing. And so that's not really prevention, that's more intervention on the back end. But folks at all points of the justice system and their interactions struggle with housing. So you could reach out to your local probation and parole chief and have a conversation with them. Many rural communities don't have a pretrial service agency, or they could be embedded within the court system. That's another great way to chat with people.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate that insight. We have another question here, which I'll pose to both of you, if either of you are comfortable answering. So a participant asked, they're looking for ideas. They're having challenges finding and getting youth experiencing homelessness to participate in a youth advisory board. Anyone with success in this area, or any tips from our speakers around that?
We're deeply engaged in work right now on the meaningful inclusion of people who use drugs. So we, as technical assistance providers, we encourage in your consortium engagement and retention to bring impacted people to the table and not harm them in the process, and respect and learn and begin delivering services that are relevant and impactful to these individuals. And we've made appreciable progress, and we have a peer advisory board. We have an advisory board of advisory council of people who use drugs working with us, and we're developing materials to that. But fortunately, we didn't have to start at square one. So what I would like to share with individuals who are going to engage with any vulnerable or marginalized populations, to bring them to the table and get their meaningful, and that's a very important word, meaningful inclusion, not token inclusion. And this comes from AIDS United. AIDS United crushed it in getting impacted people to the table, and they have a document called Meaningful Involvement of People Who Use Drugs. Nothing about us without us. Lots of language in there and lots of recommendations. Some of the input is, do you compensate people for their participation in the meetings? Do you offer training and support for these people? And don't say these people either. So to I'm struggling with not using other language right now, but I'm going to lean into it, whatever. How do you include people in your services, consultative processes, advisory boards, and research? Do you involve people in program development and evaluation? So we encourage a meaningful involvement. You're at the table because you are an expert. We compensate you for your time here. We are going to have you involved in the assessment of needs in the community, the strategic planning of the programming, the implementation of that, and then the measure of it as well, from soup to nuts, have you involved. But there's a fair amount of treating of the soil that will need to take place within your consortium, organization, government, or whatever, so that you do not allow your biases that you've come about honestly. So biases, everyone's got them, and if we try to pretend that we don't, no one's going to want to talk about them. But sometimes people feel some kind of way about people experiencing homelessness, people experiencing addiction. We have biases that run along race, gender, sexual orientation. We come about them honestly. We leave them unexplored and unaddressed. They will drive the bus into discriminatory and harmful practices. So my first thing is, let's normalize the presence of bias. Let's standardize the exploration of it, and then let's offer tools to help manage it. And the medical practice has done some good progress in standardizing that. They're not really killing it yet, but I'm happy to share what we've curated from AIDS United as our starting point. We're not ready really to share what we've prepared regarding consortium work, but that's what I have.
So I just want to offer, in terms of who to reach out to identify some of the youth, just a couple of suggestions I might have, with the caveat that, to Donald's point, only doing it in a way that does not cause additional trauma, any harm, when you bring them into the conversation. And youth are particularly challenging. There's parents involved, and there's whole other layers of conversation. So I think schools are a great place to go to have these conversations. I've had many family members in my family that are school teachers, and they will say, we know who the kids are that need more from us. And they do know who good fits for these types of endeavors would be. And then juvenile probation officers as well could give you the same insight. And there you get multiple layers of lived experience that the youth can bring to the table. And again, they should be able to tell you who might be appropriate to be a part of those conversations, meaning they're ready to be part of that type of experience.
Thank you both. We have a question. I think this is about both funding experience opportunities that you shared for your organizations that you're working with. I'm with a tribally designated housing entity. We do not have a 501c3. We do have state exemption. Will that qualify for these programs? I believe that's for either the HRSA or
and for you
COSAP.
as well, with your toolkit. Who's eligible for these funding opportunities? You would have to look in the funding opportunity itself to see the eligibility requirements for them. So I don't know right offhand. I do know we have that many tribal entities are funded, tribal governments, for sure.
So to speak to the COSAP one that I put the specific link in the chat, there is within the local category a subcategory for tribal and rural. And within that describes who is and is not eligible. If you look, this is actually a really good question if you are real serious about wanting to pursue this application, to reach out to our response center at BJA, because they are very, very good at responding quickly to these types of very nitty-gritty types of questions. And eligibility is one that you want to get right, because you don't want to write the whole application and then submit it for somebody to go, sorry. So I would strongly encourage you, if that's the one you're looking at, to reach out. There's also, if you're not familiar with another, two other, and I can try to Google them really quick and put them in the chat, or I can follow up after, for in terms of tribal. One is the comprehensive, oh my gosh, we do everything by acronym. It's very painful for us and for others, but it's called CTAS. So it has a whole bunch of different categories, and it's just for tribes to apply for. Within that, housing, I believe, criminal justice, substance use. And then there's also, I believe, a separate solicitation that is, or it might be in that, because that's the word comprehensive, right? One of the categories within that solicitation that you might otherwise be eligible for if the COSEP does not make sense for you.
And
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I threw into the chat specific to the Federal Office of Rural Health Policies, Rural Community Opioid Response Program, this specific grant opportunity, neonatal abstinence syndrome grant. That is, I think it essentially says, come get you some. Everyone can apply. Domestic, public, nonprofit, for-profit, faith, community-based, tribes, tribal orgs.
Thank you both. And Donald, to your comment earlier about the guide. So Michelle, that guide is it covers HUD programs, USDA programs, and the low-income housing tax credit opportunity. And so those are all distributed through different entities. Some are state, some are street, so on and so forth. So those would be specific to the programs, and that is outlined in the guide. But if you have more questions about that and the information in the guide, you can feel free to follow up with me and we can talk about that as well. Thank you both for those comments. And so you both shared amazing tips around how to collaborate and reaching out to different sectors and things to consider in this process. And I was just wondering if there's someone on participant now who's considering starting this process from scratch, and they're like, these are all amazing amazing advice we've received. What is a great practical very first step? Like, what's the first thing they should do if they're starting from scratch in this process of developing this collaborative approach to addressing this, or providing recovery to substance use disorders in their communities?
Well, fortunately, in many of the communities that received the grant opportunity that I work with, which is consortia driven, develop a consortium of every stakeholder to come to the table. Many of those already existed through primary prevention grants for the last 10 years. So I bring your prevention coalition to the table, and everyone's already at the table, and they've done strong work and experienced forward motion over the last 10 years. And likely what I've discovered, many of them are looking to expand their scope beyond primary prevention into increasing treatment access, harm reduction outreach, and recovery support services. Several of the grantees that we have were primary prevention coalitions that are now providing the entire or increasing access to the entire continuum of care. It's really exciting to see. But I guess taking a look at where these coalitions exist, and part of that Fletcher Center of Excellence recovery ecosystem map elements is the existence of a prevention coalition. So that's one thing. Bring everybody to the table and come together on a vision for your community, and then maybe even bring in some expertise on strategic planning to help guide you through the process of developing a vision, a mission, and some SMART goals, finding funding, etc.
And to add to that, I would say, don't invent some new thing if you don't need to, right? Everybody, all these people, yourselves included, go to all of these meetings, and sometimes you walk in the room and it's like two people different from the meeting you were at an hour ago, right? This happens to me on a daily basis. So, and especially in a rural community, right, where the same person is all things to all people, and maybe there's 12 of those people and they're all things to all the other people. So if you can, whether it's a prevention coalition, a criminal justice coordinating council, some other commission or entity, that if you just added the 3 right people, it would be the universe of everyone who should be involved. Do that. Because everyone, one, you will look like you know what you're doing. And 2, they will appreciate not one more meeting. The other thing I would say is, and I say this to a lot of justice people, judges in particular, invite yourself to the meeting. If you are not on the invite list, do not be shy. Call somebody up. And again, they want you. Housing is a problem they need to address. Please invite yourself to meetings and say and explain to them what you have to offer. They will be super excited to hear from you. At least I know justice professionals will be. I think treatment professionals likewise. So that's just another perspective.
Thank you both. We have another question here. The person stated that they personally respect the worth of everyone and the value of all folks, whether they're struggling with mental health illness or substance use disorders. They're asking for recommendations to an effective way to respond to folks who may not share their perspective and may have the perspective of, and they put, end quote, well, mental health illness is one thing and they need help, but those who are doing drugs, they should just choose not to do drugs, end quote. So how can someone effectively respond to comments like that when pursuing these collaborative approaches?
Recording in progress.
This is part of our training technical citizens. So this would be supported within your grant that you would be able to receive this.
Okay, there we go. Thank
Was
you.
that
Sorry
me?
about that. No. You're
Oh,
okay.
thank
Thank you.
God.
Sorry about that.
I've got so many windows open. I do this every day. So emotional regulation is critical. What you're engaged in changing hearts and minds, particularly around people who may be openly hostile towards people who use drugs, people experiencing addiction, is understanding that this advocacy you're engaged in is a marathon and not a sprint, or you're going to burn out real quick, or you're going to leave your rage unharnessed and it won't find clear direction, and your family will suffer and your mission will suffer as well. So emotional regulation is critical, and meeting folks where they are. And one thing that's critical to know is that when folks have these beliefs that inform their values, they've come about them honestly. They've come about them honestly, and they've been fed their lens on people who use drugs through many, many, many conduits, the media, both news media and entertainment media, through, if they are involved in first response or law enforcement, they've seen some stuff. And I do CIT training all the time for our county folks, and I do nurse orientation for our hospital ED and everything. And I say, if I can curse, y'all have seen some and you come about this honestly, normalizing this bias, but then displacing that, knowing that this is not a fixed belief. It will not remain a fixed belief, and you have an opportunity to move them into a space where they're going to love themselves better and be more impactful stakeholders in partnership with you. And it's the same techniques. It's displacing misinformation with science, with data. It is telling stories or showing stories of impacted population. This is called contact strategy. I do it everywhere I go because hopefully folks have a favorable experience with me. And to truly do contact in its purest form is I would come to you as husband, grandfather, social worker, likable intellectual fellow, and then let you know, by the way, I dealt with drug use disorder for 20 years and was hospitalized as a result. So that's critical. Michelle talks straight about meeting folks where they are and trying to put yourself in their shoes. And this is some of the very practical tactic that the medical field is giving to its people, is the cognitive component of empathy, is putting yourself in the other person's shoes, which may be like they got stinky shoes, but putting yourself into their shoes for just a moment, and you're gonna relax a little bit. You're gonna recognize this fixed belief is not static, and that there are tactics that you can utilize. And don't do it alone either, because advocacy is also a team sport. So find yourself some help. But I have seen hearts and minds transformed. I am one of them. I am a person in sustained recovery, but at the outset of my recovery and my professional credentialed experience, I was a person who harbored incredible biases against people taking opioid agonist medications, people engaging in harm reduction, people on different pathways of recovery. I am not particularly fond of that fellow, but I forgive him. He came about his biases honestly, and he's here now because folks met me where I was, and I work with one of those fellows right now. He's our harm reduction expert, and we often pair up in communities to bridge the communities of harm reduction and recovery and those workforces and those policies and practice.
So can I sort of double down on what Donald just said, which is to say, justice practitioners often interact with people when they are at their absolute lowest, and they might be at their lowest and be experiencing some of the worst times in their life for an hour, for a day, for a week, for months, or the worst year you can, or years you can imagine, with a whole lot of people coming at them. And they may not be physically feeling well on top of all of that. And the future is unknown to them. And when you, in terms of bias, when you repeatedly see, and that's your experience over and over, and you don't see the good that can come, that becomes what is your reality. And so that's where bias can come from. So some of the ways, to combat that is forcing them to look at the good stories, right? To talk with people like Donald, who have had experiences and are successful and, can change their hearts and minds. But also, one example, I ran a drug court for a number of years. When we had a graduation, we would invite the original arresting officer and their probation officer to the graduation. Hearts and minds changed. And but that's just one sort of little thing. We don't often, again, usually get to experience those because we're dealing with the next crisis or the next person in crisis or the next worst thing I've seen today or maybe in my career. So that's not as an excuse. It's what, law enforcement and others in the justice system, what they deal with every day. And so there are ways to pick away at that, as Donald said. And I had another thought and I lost it. So I would also say I couldn't have given this presentation 20 years ago for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is I wouldn't have been saying these things.
Oh, girl.
And so it took me knowing and working with and having people challenging my bias, knowing and loving people who needed to, have some grace. So I would say it takes time. I'm not going to tell you it took 20 years. It didn't take that long, but also education. Again, there was a point in time in my career where treatment people said medication assisted treatment is taboo. We shouldn't be doing that. Right. And if those are the people that I respect and trust, that's a problem. And so they evolved and therefore I could evolve. So a lot of it is, the trusted messenger, the message, time, and patience. And then to go back to Donald, a reference you made, people's hearts and minds are changed for lots of different reasons. If you can't get to their heart, maybe you got to get to their mind. And some of that is about data. Some of that is about money. And some of that is about, I'm going to sue you, or you're going to be sued.
Sometimes.
There's lots of ways, to get to change. So I'm not saying start with those ways, but they exist, and sometimes they lead to change that includes those other reasons.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you both.
I like what you said. I'm sorry. I just want to double down on the chip away. chip away. Just like when we're working with participants experiencing these behavioral health issues, we don't change or cure or solve overnight. It is a cumulative process of the experience of compassion and education and love. You mentioned love, so chip away.
Thank you both for your transparency in your own journeys and
Oh, yeah.
evolution in thought and approach. I think
Love
for
that.
me listening, and maybe for some of our participants, that's something that our housers can consider about maybe even their approaches, but also who they're partnering with and where they are in their journey and evolution of thought. So thank you for that. We're almost to time. So I have one quick question for Michelle from a participant and then one closing question for you both. Michelle, a participant asked, are probation officers typically employed by the county, state, or privately?
So yes, yes, and yes. So it really depends on where you are, the state and the locality. They can be employed by the State Department of Corrections, and that's an executive branch agency. They could be employed by the local county government, also the executive branch, or they could be employed by the state under the court or under a local court system. So, and that varies from juvenile to adult as well. But the best thing I can say to you is go reach out to those folks and ask them. And they probably will tell you all kinds of other great stuff you never knew you wanted to know. But it does look quite different from place to place.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And my last question, with there are a couple of minutes here for both of you. I was wondering if you had the name of a community or an organization that you've come across in your experience or just know of that has had some innovative approaches to this housing collaboration, whether with criminal justice or behavioral and mental health, to supporting residents in recovery.
Oh my goodness.
It's okay if that's not for
I
right
have
now.
to tell you, I get these types of questions all the time, and all these jurisdictions swim in my head. And that's an excellent question for me to follow up with you on.
Great.
I don't
That's
want you
great.
to, I don't want that to make you feel like the answer is no.
No.
Because
I have
the
a
answer
bunch.
isn't no. It is, we have over 400 active grantees right now, and I'm lucky to
Same.
remember who I'm talking to at any given moment. I feel like I'm too young for that, but it's real. But I will definitely do some research with our TA providers to make sure that what I'm sharing is people who are not just beginning that work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Same experience. I work with over 500, rural consortia that have implemented housing and as a portion of their work and have engaged in innovation, cross-sector innovation. One of the most important places, though, and I'll share, but one of the most important places, though, is we really need to solve the gap around housing for vulnerable peoples, returning citizens, people taking medications for opioid use disorder, pregnant and parenting people. The list goes on, and sometimes folks are excluded from these opportunities because they outlie, and we can't do that anymore. We can't do
Or
that.
because they're really hard to complicated cases,
Indeed. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you
Facts.
both. I think we'll follow up with some potential organizations or communities. I was just seeing if there was one that maybe spoke to this morning that was on top of mind, but we can follow up with our participants with maybe some of that information. I just want to thank you both so much for your vulnerability and transparency and for sharing your expertise with us today. So many tangible takeaways for me, and I'm hoping for our audience as well. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Michelle and Donald, thank you again. And thank you everyone for attending. Hope you have a great day. Thank you all.